of dreams mingled with happiness. The lovers saw each other every day. Cassette came with M. Fauchelevent. "This is reversing things," said Mademoiselle Gilliner Mand, "to have the bride come to the house to do the courting like this." But Marius' convalescence had caused the habit to become established. And the armchairs of the Rue de Fils du Calvaire, better adapted to interviews than the straw chairs of the Rue de l'Homme Arme, had rooted it. Marius and M. Fauchelevent saw each other, but did not address each other. It seemed as though this had been agreed upon. Every girl needs a chaperone. Cassette could not have come without M. Fauchelevent. In Marius' eyes, M. Fauchelevent was the condition attached to Cassette. He accepted it. By dint of discussing political matters, vaguely and without precision, from the point of view of the general amelioration of the fate of all men, they came to say a little more than yes and no. Once, on the subject of education, which Marius wished to have free and obligatory, multiplied under all forms, lavished on every one, like the air and the sun, in a word, respirable for the entire population, they were in unison, and they almost conversed. M. Fauchelevent talked well, and even with a certain loftiness of language, still he lacked something indescribable. M. Fauchelevent possessed something less and also something more, than a man of the world. Marius, inwardly, and in the depths of his thought, surrounded with all sorts of mute questions this M. Fauchelevent, who was to him simply benevolent and cold. There were moments when doubts as to his own recollections occurred to him. There was a void in his memory, a black spot, an abyss excavated by 4 months of agony. Many things had been lost therein. He had come to the point of asking himself whether it were really a fact that he had seen M. Fauchelevent, so serious and so calm a man, in the barricade. This was not, however, the only stupor which the apparitions and the disappearances of the past had left in his mind. It must not be supposed that he was delivered from all those obsessions of the memory which force us, even when happy, even when satisfied, to glance sadly behind us. The head which does not turn backwards towards horizons that have vanished contains neither thought nor love. At times, Marius clasped his face between his hands, and the vague and tumultuous past traversed the twilight which reigned in his brain. Again he beheld Mabeuf fall, he heard Gavroche singing amid the grape shot, he felt beneath his lips the cold brow of Eponine. Enjolras, Courfeyrac, Jean Prouvaire, Combeferre, Bossuet, Grantaire, all his friends rose erect before him, then dispersed into thin air. Were all those dear, sorrowful, valiant, charming, or tragic beings merely dreams? Had they actually existed? The revolt had enveloped everything in its smoke. These great fevers create great dreams. He questioned himself. He felt himself. All these vanished realities made him dizzy. Where were they all then? Was it really true that all were dead? A fall into the shadows had carried off all except himself. It all seemed to him to have disappeared as though behind the curtain of a theater. There are curtains like this which drop in life. God passes on to the following act. And he himself, was he actually the same man? He, the poor man, was rich. He, the abandoned, had a family. He, the despairing, was to marry Cassette. It seemed to him that he had traversed a tomb, and that he had entered into it black and had emerged from it white, and in that tomb the others had remained. At certain moments, all these beings of the past, returned and present, formed a circle around him, and overshadowed him. Then he thought of Cassette, and recovered his serenity. But nothing less than this felicity could have sufficed to efface that catastrophe. M. Fauchelevent almost occupied a place among these vanished beings. Marius hesitated to believe that the Fauchelevent of the barricade was the same as this Fauchelevent in flesh and blood, sitting so gravely beside Cassette. The first was, probably, one of those nightmares occasioned and brought back by his hours of delirium. However, the natures of both men were rigid, no question from Marius to M. Fauchelevent was possible. Such an idea had not even occurred to him. We have already indicated this characteristic detail. Two men who have a secret in common, and who, by a sort of tacit agreement, exchange not a word on the subject, are less rare than is commonly supposed. Once only, did Marius make the attempt. He introduced into the conversation the Rue de la Chanvrerie, and, turning to M. Fauchelevent, he said to him, "Of course, you are acquainted with that street?" "What street?" "The Rue de la Chanvrerie." "I have no idea of the name of that street," replied M. Fauchelevent, in the most natural manner in the world. The response, which bore upon the name of the street and not upon the street itself, appeared to Marius to be more conclusive than it really was. Decidedly, thought he, I have been dreaming. I have been subject to a hallucination. It was someone who resembled him. M. Fauchelevent was not there. Chapter 8. Two men impossible to find. Marius' enchantment, great as it was, could not efface from his mind other preoccupations. While the wedding was in preparation, and while awaiting the date fixed upon, he caused difficult and scrupulous retrospective researches to be made. He owed gratitude in various quarters. He owed it on his father's account, he owed it on his own. There was Thénardier. There was the unknown man who had brought him, Marius, back to M. Guillenard. Marius endeavored to find these two men. Not intending to marry. To be happy, and to forget them, and fearing that, were these debts of gratitude not discharged, they would leave a shadow on his life, which promised so brightly for the future. It was impossible for him to leave all these arrears of suffering behind him, and he wished, before entering joyously into the future, to obtain a quittance from the past. That Thénardier was a villain detracted nothing from the fact that he had saved Colonel Pontmercy. Thénardier was a ruffian in the eyes of all the world except Marius. And Marius, ignorant of the real scene in the battlefield of Waterloo, was not aware of the peculiar detail. That his father, so far as Thénardier was concerned, was in the strange position of being indebted to the latter for his life, without being indebted to him for any gratitude. None of the various agents whom Marius employed succeeded in discovering any trace of Thénardier. Obliteration appeared to be complete in that quarter. Madame Thénardier had died in prison pending the trial. Thénardier and his daughter Azelma, the only two remaining of that lamentable group, had plunged back into the gloom. The gulf of the social unknown had silently closed above those beings. On the surface there was not visible so much as that quiver, that trembling, those obscure concentric circles which announce that something has fallen in, and that the plummet may be dropped. Madame Thénardier being dead. Boulatruelle being eliminated from the case. Claquesous having disappeared, the principal persons accused having escaped from prison, the trial connected with the ambush in the Gorbeau house had come to nothing. That affair had remained rather obscure. The bench of assizes had been obliged to content themselves with two subordinates. Punchard, alias Printanier, alias Bigrenelle, and Demiliard, alias Dumilliards, who had been inconsistently condemned, after a hearing of both sides of the case, to 10 years in the galleys. Hard labor for life had been the sentence pronounced against the escaped and contumacious accomplices. Thénardier, the head and leader, had been, through contumacy, likewise condemned to death. This sentence was the only information remaining about Thénardier, casting upon that buried name its sinister light like a candle beside a bier. Moreover, by thrusting Thénardier back into the very remotest depths, through a fear of being recaptured, this sentence added to the density of the shadows which enveloped this man. As for the other person, as for the unknown man who had saved Marius, the researches were at first to some extent successful, then came to an abrupt conclusion. They succeeded in finding the carriage which had brought Marius to the Rue de Fils du Calvaire on the evening of the 6th of June. The coachman declared that, on the 6th of June, In obedience to the commands of a police agent, he had stood from 3 o'clock in the afternoon until nightfall on the quai des Champs-Élysées, above the outlet of the Grand Sewer. That, towards 9 o'clock in the evening, the grating of the sewer, which abuts on the bank of the river, had opened. That a man had emerged therefrom, bearing on his shoulders another man, who seemed to be dead. That the agent, who was on the watch at that point, had arrested the living man and had seized the dead man. That, at the order of the police agent, he, the coachman, had taken all those folks into his carriage. That they had first driven to the Rue de Fils du Calvaire. That they had there deposited the dead man. That the dead man was Monsieur Marius, and that he, the coachman, recognized him perfectly, although he was alive this time. That afterwards, they had entered the vehicle again, that he had whipped up his horses. A few paces from the gate of the archives, they had called to him to halt. That there, in the street, they had paid him and left him, and that the police agent had led the other man away. That he knew nothing more. That the night had been very dark. Marius, as we have said, recalled nothing. He only remembered that he had been seized from behind by an energetic hand at the moment when he was falling backwards into the barricade. Then, everything vanished so far as he was concerned. He had only regained consciousness at M. Gillenormand's. He was lost in conjectures. He could not doubt his own identity. Still, how had it come to pass that, having fallen in the Rue de la Chanvrerie, he had been picked up by the police agent on the banks of the Seine, near the Pont des Invalides? Someone had carried him from the Quartier des Halles to the Champs-Élysées. And how? Through the sewer. Unheard of devotion. Someone? Who? This was the man for whom Marius was searching. Of this man, who was his savior, nothing. Not a trace. Not the faintest indication. Marius, although forced to preserve great reserve, in that direction, pushed his inquiries as far as the prefecture of police. There, no more than elsewhere, did the information obtained lead to any enlightenment. The prefecture knew less about the matter than did the hackney coachman. They had no knowledge of any arrest having been made on the 6th of June at the mouth of the Grand Sewer. No report of any agent had been received there upon this matter, which was regarded at the prefecture as a fable. The invention of this fable was attributed to the coachman. A coachman who wants a gratuity is capable of anything, even of imagination. The fact was assured, nevertheless, and Marius could not doubt it, unless he doubted his own identity, as we have just said. Everything about this singular enigma was inexplicable. What had become of that man? That mysterious man, whom the coachman had seen emerge from the grating of the Grand Sewer bearing upon his back the unconscious Marius, and whom the police agent on the watch had arrested in the very act of rescuing an insurgent. What had become of the agent himself? Why had this agent preserved silence? Had the man succeeded in making his escape? Had he bribed the agent? Why did this man give no sign of life to Marius, who owed everything to him? His disinterestedness was no less tremendous than his devotion. Why had not that man appeared again? Perhaps he was above compensation, but no one is above gratitude. Was he dead? Who was the man? What sort of a face had he? No one could tell him this. The coachman answered. The night was very dark. Basque and Nicolette, all in a flutter, had looked only at their young master all covered with blood. The porter, whose candle had lighted the tragic arrival of Marius, had been the only one to take note of the man in question, and this is the description that he gave. That man was terrible. Marius had the blood-stained clothing which he had worn when he had been brought back to his grandfather preserved, in the hope that it would prove of service in his researches. On examining the coat, it was found that one skirt had been torn in a singular way. A piece was missing. One evening, Marius was speaking in the presence of Cosette and Jean Valjean of the whole of that singular adventure, of the innumerable inquiries which he had made, and of the fruitlessness of his efforts. The cold countenance of Monsieur Fauchelevent angered him. He exclaimed, with a vivacity which had something of wrath in it. Yes, that man, whoever he may have been, was sublime. Do you know what he did, sir? He intervened like an archangel. He must have flung himself into the midst of the battle, have stolen me away, have opened the sewer, have dragged me into it and have carried me through it. He must have traversed more than a league and a half in those frightful subterranean galleries. Bent over, weighed down, in the dark, in the cesspool, more than a league and a half, sir, with a corpse upon his back. And with what object? With the sole object of saving the corpse. And that corpse I was. He said to himself. There may still be a glimpse of life there, perchance. I will risk my own existence for that miserable spark. And his existence he risked not once but 20 times. And every step was a danger. The proof of it is, that on emerging from the sewer, he was arrested. Do you know, sir, that that man did all this? And he had no recompense to expect. What was I? An insurgent. What was I? One of the conquered. Oh! If Cassette 600,000 francs were mine. They are yours, interrupted Jean Valjean. Well, resumed Marius, I would give them all to find that man once more. Jean Valjean remained silent.